So my name is Sir Mark Prescott. I'm a racehorse trainer in Newmarket and lover of all field sports. My father was a farmer in Devon, but he was also a lawyer, and he'd been a prisoner of war in Japan for 2.5 years, so he was probably much damaged, really, although I didn't know that, but Mum always said you never really knew him because he was so much changed. But he wasn't interested in horses at all. I learnt to ride because there was a pretty girl down the road who rode very nicely, and I thought it would be a good idea. And so I started to learn when I was about 8 or 9, I suppose. And there was a lovely woman who taught me to ride, who had a small holding called Frances Selly. And when she saw how small I was and how keen I was, she thought I'd make a jockey. So I was a sad disappointment to her in that respect. And but she wouldn't take any money for teaching me to ride. And so the old man took her to Newton Abbot races because she wouldn't take any money, because she said I helped out and mucked out and all the rest. I used to cycle down there every day. I just loved it. And anyway, the first day we went racing, and the story is correct. The first day we went racing, we parked right by the last fence at Newton Abbot, and I was too small to see over, and the field came thundering round, and I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the whoa, whack, 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 and this thing somersaulted right in front of us. And of course, racing, you're so close that that crashed to the ground a couple of feet from me, over the jockey, brought down 2 more. And the other horses got up, the 3 horses got up, and the 2 jockeys got up, and the other one lay absolutely motionless. Obviously he was dead, you know. And very, very slowly he got up, and he chucked his stick into the crowd, and he said, "Fucking hell," and walked back up the track. I thought, what a man. And I never wanted to do anything else. And his name was Tim Brookshaw. And when Chris Pitt wrote the excellent book on Tim Brookshaw, which if you haven't read, you should do, he rang me up and said, you know, what can you tell me about Tim Brookshaw? You rode at the same time. And so I told him this story, thinking that it was probably all wrong. And when you're a child, you know, you get things muddled up, and it's 60 odd years ago, 70 years ago. And Chris rang me up that night and said it was August the 11th. You were 11 years old. The horse was called April Stake. It did get brought down. And I'd remembered everything right. Fascinating, isn't it? So it obviously made a great impression. And when I had the terrible fall at Waugh races in Kent, which don't exist anymore, I was totally paralysed. I couldn't blink and I couldn't swallow, and totally paralysed. And I wound up at Ashford Cottage Hospital for a while and made no progress. And then I went to Oswestry Orthopaedic, which was simply fantastic. And the first visitor I had in his wheelchair was Tim Brookshaw, who, poor man, was paralysed from the waist down. And I said to him, "It's because of you I'm here. You are my hero. It's entirely because of you I'm here." So it's strange, isn't it? Mrs. Selly got me to ride out for the local trainer, who was the most wonderful man, called Sid Kernick. And he broke in difficult horses. We only had 12 boxes, 6 racehorses, and 6 being broken in. And the 6 that were being broken in, he charged double, because he would only have them if someone had tried to break them in and couldn't do so. So it was a good business model, because you could charge double because no one else could do it. So we saw everything. We had absolutely everything. And I mean, it was fantastically exciting. And he was a wonderful horseman. So he said to me one day, We used to have everything. We used to have a little pony that was darting out in the collecting ring. We'd have one of those to straighten out. We'd have a cart horse they couldn't break in. We'd have one riding side saddle. We had absolutely everything, you know. Anyway, so he said to me, he said, "Now then, boy," he says, "it's time you had a ride." He says, "You can ride that horse next week at Wincanton." So I said, "Well, I'm too young, you know. You've got to be 17 in England in those days to have a ride under rules." Well, he said, "When was you born?" So I said, 3/3/48. So he put down 3/3/46. And I rode it and it won. And it won, bloody thing. It never won in its life. It was 12, it won. And so I thought I was the National Hunt Messiah that National Hunt Racing was waiting for. It was so easy, you know. Went back to school the next day. Yeah, I couldn't believe it, you know. So thanks to Mr. Kernick, I started very young. But he was a tremendous man, you know. I learned everything about difficult horses from him. And I learned a good bit about how to put a good face on training bad horses and having a tough life. I mean, you know, when I came to Newmarket, I couldn't believe how easy it was when you'd been down there. And we didn't have any gallops. We borrowed a field, and whoever was riding the lead horse had to bark like a sheepdog to get the sheep out of the way. You know, we went round in the evenings clipping everybody's ponies, make a few quid. We used to go around all evening clipping and pulling manes. And Mrs. Kernick was very, very jealous of Sid. She always felt he was having affairs. And when we used to get back, she used to play hell. And he always used to say, "Now then, boy, you was with me. You was with me all evening." "Was I? Were you?" I said, "No, Mrs. Kernick was with me all evening." But what I'd forgotten was when he clipped it, he used to say, "Now then, boy," he says, "you pull its mane and tail. I'm going to have a cup of tea with Mrs. Huntley Jones." I had no idea what a cup of tea with Mrs. Huntley Jones involved. So it was just wonderful. And then he sent me to Frank Cundell. And Frank Cundell was keen to have an amateur. William Pigott Brown had done very well for him and had now retired. But I never got on. I never got on well there. Everything went wrong. Our road schooling thing would break its leg or get beaten on odds-on shot at Taunton. And I just never, ever made any progress. That came to an end when I broke my back. But it was the only place I've been where I just couldn't get on. And it wasn't Mr. Cundell's fault. He was a marvellous man. When I was there, he had Crudwell, who won 50 races. He won his 50th race when I was there. 50. I mean, you know, you can't place a horse better than that, can you? The horse won 50 races. So he was a great man to learn from. But I just never made any progress. And then I had all that spell in hospital. And when I got out of hospital, I was back home in Devon, and Jack Leach, famous jockey, won the Guineas on Adam's Apple, wrote a wonderful book on racing called Sods I've Cut on the Turf. Fantastic title. Jack was having an affair with a very glamorous woman who lived in Newmarket, who was known as Midnight Mary. And she had had a fling with my stepfather when he was up at Cambridge. And Jack and Mary needed a safe house for a weekend. So they came down to stay with my parents. But my stepfather knew nothing about racing, but I was hugely impressed to have Jack Leach. And anyway, they went back at the end of their hopefully lovely weekend. And Jack Leach was on the Heath here in Newmarket, bumped into Jack Waugh, and said, "How are you?" And Mr. Waugh said, "Do you know, I'm struggling a bit. I could do with an assistant." And Jack Leach said, "I saw just the man last weekend." So he rang me up and said he'd fixed up for me to meet Mr. Waugh at Newbury 2 days later, and I was to be there at 2:30, see the 2:30 race and have a word with him. And so I got to Newbury, drove from Devon, got to Newbury, watched the horse run, I'm afraid, rather badly. Went over and had a word with the great man, and I said, my name's Mark Prescott, I'm from Devon. Well done, he said. He said, you better come up and have a month's trial, see how we get on. I said, when would you like me to start? So he said, I'd start tomorrow, I'll see you 11 o'clock. So I was in Newbury. So I said, thank you very much, I'll be there. So I drove back down to Devon, that was 4 hours. I packed everything I got, left Devon at about 2 o'clock, 3:30. Drove up here, got here about 9 o'clock, had breakfast and started at 11, and I never went back home again. I never saw home again. And I worked for Mr. Waugh for 2.5 magical years, and I never had a day off. He never said to me, it's Christmas Day, would you like to go and see your parents? They came up here, but I never went back home again. I could ride a hack and things, and I was quite good on the ground, driving yearlings, breaking in. Thanks to Mr. Kernick, I could do all of that standing on my ears. But I didn't ride racehorses unless we were very short. Mr. Waugh had 50, I have 50. He had the same boxes I've got now. I've never had more, and I've never had less. And 50 was quite a big stable in those days. And the great story is that, which is absolutely true, is I met him at 11 o'clock outside the wall here. Beautiful sunny day. Well done, he says, come on in, boy. He came in the front door, and it was a beautiful hot day, and when the front door's open and the back door's open, you can see the paddock through the house. And Mrs. Waugh was on the stairs, and just imagine this, she was inking in red biro the bare bits of cord on the stairs. And he smacked her on the bottom as he went by. And he said, now that's the best missus in Britain. You can't get on with her, you can't get on with anyone. So I said, thank you. So we went out, and Jack Button, the head lad, was lunging a yearling, and he said, that's Jack Button. If you can't get on with him, you can't get on with anyone. So he said, by now, not being a fool, you'll have worked out the worst thing about this job is me. And he was right. He was very, very difficult, very touchy. But I grew to love him, and I had 2.5 fantastic years with him. And I can never repay what I owe him or Sid Kernick, really. You know, they without them, anybody who says they got on without anybody else is deluding themselves. They were fantastic people. And funnily enough, I've been in the game 60 years since, and I still think they were good. Do you see what I mean? Mr. Kernick breaking horses. And Mr. Waugh, he set a standard. You know, if he said something would happen, it would happen. It would happen. We had Star Moss finish second in the Derby and the St Leger. We had Almirante won the Ribblesdale. He just had, before I got here, Matador. And then Oncidium was favourite for the Derby. So it was an exciting time. He wore a path from my back door to number 17 box when Oncidium was favourite for the Derby. You could see the path for about 17 years. And it was a terrible blow when he got beaten. You know, Santa Claus won. Eve Smith made a bit too much use of him. And nowadays he probably had a mucky scope as well, but you didn't know in those days, you know. But he coughed a couple of times the week before. So it was very tense, and I drove Mr. Waugh and Mrs. Waugh down there, and he criticised my driving the whole way. And all those cars used to boil over in those days, and they were all stuck at the side of the road. It was grillingly hot. And after the race, the horse he was in front in the dip, and he finished fourth, and Lord Howard didn't come and see the horse afterwards. And that was a mistake, because Mr. Waugh was never the same again. I can remember him saying to the lad, "Take it away. It doesn't seem his lordship's got the manners to come and see us." And it was never the same. He was favourite or second favourite, yeah. So that was, yes, it was exciting times, you know, and there was all the threats to dope them, and I slept in the box next to him, and Pinchurischio had been badly injured in his stable the year before when favourite for the Guineas. So, and the doping people, which is so well written about in that book, Doped, by Jamie Reed. Well, one of our horses was one of those horses doped there. So, it was a very different place, and everything was very different to what it is now. We all went to church on Sunday. Jim Bulger can still keep it going, but we all did the same, and the church was all decorated like Harvest Festival at the beginning of the season, with rugs and colours and saddles. It looked marvellous, you know. So it was just a different world. I've got a picture of the string walking down the road, and there's two shops at the bottom of the road, and one is a piano shop. How many pianos did you sell? One's a piano shop, and the other's Olga's wool shop, which was for ladies who did plaiting and things, you know. So it was, we rode them back through the high street. You know, lots changed, lot for the better, lot for the worse. He became ill, and was ill really when I came, and funnily enough, when he retired, he lived another 20 years, but he was ill. He'd been badly shot up in the war. He was at Dieppe, which was the first fiasco of the war when all the Canadians got killed. He got off, and then he was at Dunkirk within 9 months, and he was wounded at both. And he was plagued by, although he never said so, he was plagued by survivor's guilt, and that the friends he'd gone with had not come back. And the only time he ever spoke to me about the war, twice, was once he said, "My experiences have been a thief of sleep in the night." What a phrase, isn't it? A thief of sleep in the night. And the other was that when I was first here, Tom Hobbs ran the ironmonger shop and used to get wonderful things, all the brooms and all the stable equipment there. And he'd been a Japanese POW. And Mr. Waugh sent me to buy 4 mangers, plastic mangers. And there was a new place just started up. Mr. Waterfall, he's still going, Horse Requisites. So I went down there and I bought these mangers, £1 off, 4 of them. And I brought them back and I said to the governor, you know, I bought these, but they're £1 cheaper than they are at Hobbs's. He said, "Will you take them back?" He said, "Mr. Hobbs didn't spend 2.5 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp so that you could knock £1 off a manger." So I realised that the war still played a significant part, and I took them back for Mr. Waterfall. I still see him now and laugh about it. So anyway, you can't believe it. One day he said, "Oh, I'm fed up with training these." He said, "You better train them next year." That would have been about May or June, and nothing was said again. And in September he said, "I've had a word with all the owners." He said, "They've bought the yard for you on an interest-free loan. You've got 10 years to pay them back. Lord Howard de Walden won't be staying." That was it. So, and I'm proud to say I trained for all of them until they died. They were wonderful people. And my stepfather, who was by then father had died, and my stepfather was a marvellous chap, and he said, when I told him this, he said, "What have we got on paper?" I said, "We haven't got anything." And he said, "And what do you think about that?" So I said, "I think we just say thank you very much." And there was nothing on paper, and I paid them all back in 10 years. Old Bell Royal at Stockton, nobody ever forgets their first kiss or their first winner. And I'd only had a couple of runners, so Eric Eldin rode her, owned by Lady Macdonald Buchanan. She was out of Sun Cap, who won the Oaks, and she won another couple for us that year as well. Stockton no longer, very good racecourse, very good track, cold, foggy. And I ran a 2-year-old up there as well, and I thought it could go, little black filly. And in the paddock there was one, of course there was no dope in those days for doping horses, and there was one, Brian Connaughton was riding it, was clipped one side and not the other, and it was chucked him off a couple of times, and mine was black and sleek, and I remember thinking, well, anyway, when I finished second in the winner's enclosure with Brian Connaughton all half clipped, so I quickly learned I wasn't as good as I thought I was. Marching On was good sprinter, tiny horse by Tudor Melody, sort of a leftover, and then nothing really happened. It was real hard work, and you felt you were losing ground a bit. And then in 1980, Spindrifter came along, and he won the world record number of 2-year-old races at the time, equalled it with Nagua, and I thought again how clever I was, and within 5 years Bill O'Gorman had won 18 with Providio, so you think you're good, but there's always somebody else. He was sound, he always ate up, he was a thorough professional, he never made a fuss about anything, and Alpinista was the same, she never made a fuss about anything. And they got those horses, they get better and better because they take it and they're not worried. And he got better. He was owned by a lovely man called Graham Waters, who had a caravan park at Clacton. And he was his first horse. And he just transformed his life. But I said to Mr. Waters in March, you can either win a lot of races or you can go to Ascot and finish second in the Windsor Castle. Well, that's the truth of where this horse lies. What would you like? He said, oh, I'll win a lot of races. And so he won 10 off the reel and 13 in total. He won 3. And I then trained later on his nephew called Musafi for Mr. Waters. And he won 7 in 17 days on 6 different courses. So it was in the genes a bit. It was in the genes a bit. That is fantastic. Seven races in 17 days, 6 different tracks. I mean, you can imagine doing it in America where you're on the same track. But he went up to Brighton and down to Southall and he went everywhere. And I used to jog him up every morning and think he can't run again, And I'd jog him up and he'd shake his head. I'd say, off you go, And finally, when he'd won 7 in the reel, he didn't shake his head. and that was it. But it's interesting that the two horses were so closely related. And bred by one of the great men of Ireland, Joe Crowley. When Spindrifter broke his leg, we went back to try and buy another one from the family. And Spindrifter was trying to break Nagua's record. And Nagua's mother and Spindrifter's mother were in the field together. Joe Crowley had bred them both. What a man. What a man. He never followed my advice over anything and proved me wrong every single time, He used to say, what do you think of that? And I'd say, well, you can't do that, Joe. And of course he'd do it. I think I owed a tremendous amount to Spindrifter, and then along came Pivotal. And he was bred by Cheveley Park, And you see your luck, you need your luck in. He won the Cork and Orrery, as it was then, by half a length, but nobody knew he'd won. One was one side and one was the other. And then he won the Nunthorpe, having got beaten in the July Cup, he won the Nunthorpe by a short head. You need luck. He could have easily got beaten in those two. And he won them both. Duffield at his prime. What a ride he gave them. And but Duffield and Pivotal were made for one another. They brought out the best in each other, you know. And George rode for us for 31 years. 900 winners, I think he rode for me. And then Seb rode for us for 13 years and Morris for 11. So I've only had three jockeys in my whole career, which says a great deal for them and me. So, and then after Pivotal, really, I suppose there was Albarada, the first for Miss Rousing. And then things picked up, and last second, of course, I had at the same time as Pivotal. So I wound up having champion sprinter and the champion mile and a quarter filly at the same time, which when you only got 50 boxes, you need a slice of luck to get there. And so we had this marvellous period. And the boys, Osborne House, you know, they had Pasternak and all those big gambles and Chivalry. So it was a very exciting period. Graham Rock was the guiding light who founded the Racing Post, and Graham was a punter through and through, you know, and he used to spend all his time, you know, trying to think how he could. John Brown always said, I trained for John Brown, who was head of William Hill. He said he told all the people working for him that every night somewhere in England, 5 men are sitting around a table in a pub trying to think of a way of screwing him. That's what John Brown always described it. And one of those 5 men was Graham Rock, who spent his whole life thinking about how he could. And, you know, a couple of them came up. Pasternak came up because the bet was to win the Magnet and the Cambridgeshire. And he only ran twice that year and he won them both. And then Chivalry, of course, who'd not run for a year, the only horse ever to win the Cambridgeshire without having run that season, ever. So Rock was always thinking of these sort of obscure things, and some of them came up and a lot of them didn't, but certainly the boys finished in front. Yeah, it's much more difficult now, and it was much easier then. I always remember going to Gough Sales after Pasternak, and it was the next day walking around, and of course the rumour mill had made the money won infinitely more than it was. And I started by trying to say to everybody, no, I'm afraid it wasn't. In the end, I just said, thank you very much. But by the time we got to the evening, the amount of money had trebled anyway. But I gave up trying to. It spoilt the story. There were those big handicappers, Pasternak, and then Albarada and Albanova and Marsha. And the one who everybody forgets is Hooray, who won the Cheveley Park. She was the highest rated 2-year-old filly in the world that year, and she's completely forgotten. She won the Cheveley Park 4 or 5 lengths. And as a 2-year-old, she could go, you know. She didn't make a broodmare. She was sold in the end for 8,000 when she was quite elderly. And she produced nothing. And she just seemed to get forgotten, you know. Nobody ever says you had Hooray. They remember all those other horses we've mentioned. But I always feel she was the forgotten one. And Confidential Lady, who won the French Oaks, both owned by Cheveley Park, as well as Pivotal. So I've been very lucky to have Cheveley Park and Miss Rousing, and most of my best horses have been elite racing. They bred all those good horses. You know, you didn't buy them; they were bred. So, you know, how lucky can you be? I mean, it's a great day for anybody to win a race like that. I don't care who you are or how many big winners you've had. But it was made more great by the fact that I'd trained her grandmother and her mother, and Miss Rousing had had horses with me for nearly 40 years, and Morris had ridden for me for 11 seasons. If you can't get a kick or a bit of pride out of that, So it was a great day, and the French were marvellous. I got kissed by Rouget, I got kissed by Favre, I got kissed by everybody. It wasn't what I set out, but it was simply a wonderful day. But the three things I remember was about it is, first of all, Miss Rousing in the taxi going back, and she turned round and she said, do you know, I always thought she'd win. Marvellous. But that's a bit like my mother, I said, who was the only person who ever thought I'd pass my exams, But Miss Rousing had this touching faith. And then Luke, I said to Luke, how about that, Luke, And he said, well, the 2 nights before the Arc, he said, I've watched 28 Arc de Triomphe. And he said, when I turned for home, I suddenly realised I was going better than any of the 28. And the third thing was that when I got home, I looked at the wonderful emails and everything that people had been kind enough to send. And I looked at them in reverse order, you see. So the first email, the race was run at, let's say, 3:10. The first email came in at 3:15. And it was from that great man, Mick Shannon. And Mick Shannon had had 3 runners-up in the Arc. 3. And this email had come by, it must have been as she was pulling up. And it just said, lucky fucker. So that's the Arc de Triomphe for you. Miss Rousing, Luke Morrison and lucky fucker. Marvellous. Well, it's the most modern yard in Newmarket, I suppose. It's got a pool, it's got a treadmill, it's got a marvellous covered ride, it's got extraordinary adaptable starting stalls. It's the most modern in what it's got, certainly for a 50-horse stable. But I've tried to make it so no one can see it. All the modern things are at the back. And if Fred Archer, who was apprenticed here, or Matt Dawson, who until Henry Cecil and Aidan was the most successful trainer in history, if Matt Dawson and Archer came back, they'd find their way around. They'd find their way around. They'd have a few surprises, but I hope everything is as much the same. And Mrs. Challoner over the other side. Yeah. Well, there used to be more in the middle of the town because over the years the town properties have gradually got developed, and now the stables were out. But when I came, there were 750 horses and 35 trainers. And now there's 2,500 horses and 81 trainers. So the expansion has been enormous. And that was enabled by the invention of all-weather surfaces. If you hadn't had them, you could never have done it. So the expansion was entirely due to having all-weathers. And I was chairman of the Heath Committee, which to a degree ran the gallops for 46 years. And nobody thought I did a good job, of course, but nobody wanted to do it. But we brought in all sorts of things. We had 3 very, very good jockey club agents, and were so lucky. All of them were good. And we managed to cope with the influx of horses and the traffic and the artificial surfaces, and we did a great hedges, fences. Nothing was fenced when I started. Nothing was hedged. Loose horse used to go straight across the Bury Road flower. I think we left a really good legacy, but they were very, very good, all of them. All of them were very good. And they loved Newmarket. And of course the great story about Newmarket is that Captain Marriott was the Jockey Club agent between the wars, 50 years. And he'd had a fantastic First World War, where according to Newmarket legend, he'd killed at least 3 Germans single-handedly and been much decorated. And when the Second World War started, he was still in charge of the gallops. And he, I think, managed to negotiate with the government that none of the gallops got ploughed up, except for 51 acres on railway land. And everywhere else in East Anglia had to be ploughed to prevent the Germans landing in East Anglia, because they were thought likely to land. So no grass was allowed, you see. And anyway, an American general was touring round to make sure there was nowhere where the Third Reich could land. And he came to Newmarket. There was 2,500 acres of manicured grass. He had a seizure, you see, and it was lunchtime. He couldn't find anyone lunchtime on the gallops except for an old Heath man who was banging in divots. And he said to him, "Say, farmer," he said, what's happening here?" He said, "Hitler could land the whole of the Third Reich here." And the Heathman said, "Oh no," he said, "I'm afraid not. Captain Marriott would never permit such a thing." So Captain Marriott on his own was thought to be enough to keep the Germans away. But so anyway, all the agents we've had have been obsessed really by the Heath and trying to keep it so that it's been here for 300 years. It's the most important thing in Newmarket because when you look at it, the railway went a mile under it. The motorway went 4 miles round it. We didn't get overspill. Not an acre got ploughed up in the war. So Newmarket is the Heath. Everything else is incidental. You know, we've got an uphill battle with all animal sports. We've seen what's happened to some of them. And that's basically that you've got a public now that don't understand the working animal. They understand pets, they've got them. They understand wild animals, they watch David Attenborough. But the sheepdog and the greyhound and the cattle and the sheep and the chickens, they don't understand them. And we're on the back foot because education now, the town's version of is very prevalent. So racing's got a real task. We can do a lot to help ourselves, but you've got the distinction now between people who understand animals who don't. You've got betting where people want instant satisfaction. They'd rather bet on football than have to work out racing, which is complicated. Is it well drawn? Is the jockey in form? Is the ground going to change? We all like the complexities, but a lot of the young don't. So betting's changing. You've got the government interfering in something which they don't understand. So not many winds are blowing in our favour. We need people at the top with a passion for it, with an understanding of it, who are pragmatic but prepared to concede a sensible point. I always said that the Antis made me run the Waterloo Cup better. You know, I don't agree with them, but they made me concentrate on things. So, you know, it doesn't do you any harm to have your back against the wall a bit. But, you know, I'd like Heath House to have somebody giving an interview in 100 years' time, and it's a racing stable. I'd like that to be the case. Well, when I was first here in Newmarket, I'd had an interest in the track at Slough when I was with Frank Cundell, and then when I came to Newmarket, a whole lot of cars were in a field one winter's day, and I was coming back from the abattoir in Cambridge with a great thing of grease, which you made the hoof grease for the horses out of all the fat. And there were all these cars parked, and I thought it was a farm sale. And I just pulled up Chalk Farm, Bottisham. I passed the field all the time, and there was a old boy selling cards. And I said, "What's on here?" And he said, "Coursing." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Well, go in and have a look." He said, "If you've not been, here's a card. Don't bother to pay me." And I quickly met a couple of people, racing people that were there. And within 3 months, Lady Turnbull had given me a dog called Hold Tight. And I trained him myself, so I made a cock of that. And then afterwards, Charlie Howard trained my dogs. He was uncommunicative, but a brilliant trainer. And then Charlie had them until he retired. And then Michael. So I've only had 2 trainers. Michael, the tortured genius, I always call him. I think the first Waterloo Cup that we ran after Sefton died, and we'd had to close it down for 3 years, and we had worked, the work we put in there. We put gates in, we put hair bridges in, we put fences in, we gave farmers the party, the toil that we put in, and there was a very pragmatic Waterloo Cup committee. Marvellous people. And we all, under Bill Stedman, who was the leader, as it were, and everything was against us. The landowner had died, the farmers shot all the hares got diseased, the antis were running around all over the place, the Labour government wouldn't let the police help or do anything. I can't tell you the difficulties there, the weather, it never stopped raining, frost. And we finally ran the first Waterloo Cup, a full Waterloo Cup, 64, in the open. Imagine that, in the open, 64 courses from one shy in the open. And it went really well. And I remember walking up the field with dear Fenton Kerwin, and he put his hand on my shoulder. The last course had gone, and he said, "If they want anyone to run the Olympic Games, just give us a shout." Because we had put up with everything, you know. Nobody on your side, all the press against you. Nobody on your side. At least most things, people are on your side, but that was. So I think it was as proud as I've ever been, yeah. Always. I came over with Jack Chadwick the year of Bloody Sunday. That was the first time I ever went to Clonmel. And he judged the open meeting on the Sunday. And we went back, and we had no idea, mobile phones and that sort of thing. We had no idea what had happened earlier in the day. None. Until we got to the pub in Cork, and everyone was watching the television. And the priest with the white handkerchief. So I can date it for you. That was absolutely the first time I ever went. And I've never missed Clonmel since. And it used to be hell because the Waterloo Cup was the week after. But I'd somehow do Clonmel. But the best coursing meeting I've been to was Clunanna, when Walter Dick judged and read the rule book. Do you remember that? No. Fantastic. Walter was always his own man. And he got out of bed that day and decided to judge Clunanna by the rules. Not by what had become convention, but by what the rules said. And in about the 5th or 6th course, the favourite stood up at one of the drains. And Walter sat on his horse and he watched this bitch go ping, 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 ping up to the escape. And he trotted back and he went, phew. And everybody thought he'd gone mad. And he turned with his back to them like that, and everybody's saying, well, and about 4 courses later, another one. And he trotted straight back. And by this time, it got everybody going, because suddenly everybody realised that these weren't mistakes. And everybody watched after the turn. And the excitement, I remember all the bookmakers, when the favourite had led 3 or 4 lengths and then was getting outworked, all the bookmakers shouting, 1, 2, 3. And Walter had come back. And he was in his pomp, Walter. And then the last day they were putting out those trophies, and they used to get one of those trestle tables. And Walter had had his lunch, and everybody was getting up in the stand to watch the finals. And they got the trestle out, and the voice said, "Look out!" And Walter came thundering up, jumped the trestle table, and off he went. Off he went to judge the finals. Now, it was fantastic. But of course, all the dog owners played hell. And Walter never got the job again. But what a meeting he gave us. What a meeting. And of course, Clunana judged. In my opinion, it was the best coursing you'll ever see. Yeah. You had the best of everything. You had the best of park coursing, and you had the working man. What about the working man? Yeah, the working dog had a chance. Yeah. I think coursing has been my great love, really, and certainly my great pride was the Waterloo Cup, and then, you know, I'm lucky enough to, I love the theatre. My mother was art critic for Punch for 31 years, so I was dragged to all the galleries and everything. So, and Dad was interested in I was very lucky in that both of them wanted you to be interested in. They were very different people, but they tried to make you interested in what they were interested in. So, all of us children, three of us, we had an exposure to two very different kinds of life, and I think it benefited us all. And then when I was 15, of course, I yet again got a girlfriend, and I was riding a bit, and I'd lied about how old I was, or certainly I hadn't told her how old I was. And so in the summer there was no racing for 2 months, no National Hunt racing. And she said, "Where are we going to go for a holiday?" And so it had to be somewhere where I didn't have to drive, because I couldn't drive, you see. So you know how you lie at that age. So I heard myself saying, "Oh, let's go to Pamplona," because I'd just read The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway. We'll go to Pamplona. So there was no Ryanair in those days, so once I'd researched it, we had to go on a bus from Southampton to Paris, Paris to Marseille, Marseille to Santander, Santander to Pamplona. It took 3 days. We were on our knees when we got there. And Mr. Hemingway, of course, had forgotten to tell me that the population of Pamplona, I don't know, is 20,000. But Bull Week, it's 200,000. So there's no way of getting anywhere. So this wasn't what I had in mind. We were sleeping on the steps of the government offices. But I can remember standing in the square there, and 30,000 people singing the Pamplona songs with a girlfriend, and 7 bulls that are going to hurtle up the street in an hour and a half's time. And I can remember thinking, I'm alive for the first time in my life. I am alive, you know. And those people who said that school was the best years of your life, they must have had a boring time. So and I loved the bulls, and when I started training, of course, I couldn't go, and for the first 10 years until I'd paid back. But the more I went, the more interested I became, and then you wanted to go to places. Pamplona is a wonderful atmosphere, but they're not really watching the bulls, a lot of it, you know. It's the atmosphere people go for. And then I got more sort of focused and wanted to go to Seville, and very good bullfighting in France, Arles and Nîmes. And so I have 2 or 3 weekends a year, which are in the middle of the season. They're all running bad. I think, never mind, I've got 2 weeks' time I've got coming up. So I'm very lucky. The things I've done that have been worthwhile I think, was running the Heath, and keeping the Waterloo Cup going. They're the 2 things I'm most proud of. Lots of people train horses. Oh, well, I'll totter on. William, of course, will take over when I clutch my heart and collapse, but hopefully it'll be a while off. But I love training horses. And I'm very lucky in that I haven't lost the love of training a perfectly ordinary horse. And that's a great gift. That's a great gift. I think for lots of people, when they've been at the top, it's hard to, but I've always regarded it as being like a schoolmaster. And the horses are the children, the owners are the parents, the race course is the exam. And I like teaching children, you know. I like horses. I'd have made a good schoolmaster, except I hate children. So.